Hi, my name is Leah Woodward. My partner Josh McGarvie and I will be presenting on the leadership styles of Norway and the impact that culture has had on leadership. So here is a global map showing Norway in red. Norway is located on the Scandinavian peninsula, which also includes Sweden and Denmark, which is the upper right map in orange. There are two main languages in Norway, which are Norwegian and Sami. The Norwegian language can be broken down into multiple dialects, which would be Nynorsk and Bokmål, with Bokmål being the most prolific in the country. The Sami language can also be broken down into many dialects, and this actually reflects the language of the Sami people who herd reindeer. Norwegian constitution actually protects the Sami people. We could think of the Sami as people similar to Native Americans. They actually have more autonomy in the country than Native Americans had in our country, in that Norwegians allowed them to travel the land and herd reindeer as they would have historically. And so they're very protected by the country, by the Constitution, whereas in our country, we didn't necessarily protect the Native Americans. Something that's interesting about Norway and their language is that they, as a culture, are very used to the idea of exploration of other people in other countries, other cultures, because if you think about how Norway has grown over the history of time between Viking Age to the Industrial Revolution until today, they did a lot of exploration. They rely their GDP on exports and trade. So they are used to interfacing with many different countries as a people and as organizations. But since not a lot of people speak Norwegian, they just culturally speak a lot of different languages, including English, Swedish, and Danish. So the average Norwegian is going to speak multiple languages.
To Leah's point, Norway, being such an isolated country, cooperation with surrounding countries like England and Finland have been crucial to their economic success over the centuries. Things look a little different when we look at Norway's values and how these values impact their successful leadership models. First and foremost, Norwegians are very Norway-centered. Like us Americans, they're proud to be Norwegian and align many of their ideals around this sense of ownership and belonging to the culture. Richard Lewis details in his studies that Norwegians are typically honest and pragmatic, sometimes even stubborn in their ways. As a people, Norwegians are also very individualistic and self-reliant. They value humor and conversation, but are otherwise pretty reserved. Not necessarily antisocial, but certainly reserved when it comes to sharing personal feelings. In the 20th century, Norway achieved a balance between traditional values and a modern vision. They learned to prioritize individual autonomy, where personal opinions are valued and expressed. This individuality minimized the dependency on the employer for Norwegians' livelihood. In turn, this reduced the status of the autocratic leader in Nordic countries and forced him or her to function more as a coach. These leaders or coaches are successful because they value their team. They're not necessarily held to a higher status. Now Leah's going to detail Norway's political and economic systems before we dive a little bit deeper into more specific leadership traits and how the traits contribute to success.
Norway has a constitutional monarchy for their political system. Their constitution was formed in 1814, and citizens here celebrate their constitutional freedoms in a way that's very similar to the United States 4th of July celebrations where you might see a parade, but they call this 7 Mai, and that stands for the 17th of May, which is the day that the Constitution was signed. Though the executive branch is part of the government, the king is actually viewed more as a symbolic figure. Norway also has elected judicial and legislative branches, which would resemble the US political system. However, compared to our political system, they have many more political parties that are elected, and so power is distributed amongst a greater diversity of views. Norway, like other countries, has a very high taxation rate on organizations and individual workers. And so what happens here is it lowers the incentives for organizations to grow. The generous social structure, on the other hand, means that workers are not motivated to stay in one organization for a long period of time if they don't hold the same values as the organization. So employees are a lot more mobile. The social safety nets afford Norwegians a significant amount of autonomy from their employer to be much more independent, and that requires the employers to value their employees more than perhaps in like the United States. There are some economic and political frameworks about Norway that have been scrutinized. However, they've constantly exceeded in their exports and their GDP, which really goes to reflect on the creativity of Norwegian people and their businesses, even though they might have high taxation.
Keeping in mind Norway's values and how its political system is comprised, let's quickly explore how this impacts the leadership style in the country and how Norway is arguably the world's best democracy. Richard Lewis utilizes a graphic seen in the upper right to indicate Norway's leadership style. Shown here, the graph illustrates an egalitarian model where the boss is in the center of things, but unlike other hierarchical models, the boss is friendly, approachable, and collaborative. Trust is mutual, followers look for reliability, follow through, and fresh energy from their leaders. Successful Norwegian leaders are modest, collaborative, and they're doers. They lead by example. According to the Nordic Council of Ministers analysis on Nordic leadership, leaders in Norway hold a delegation of power and responsibility to employees, as well as a high degree of consensus seeking, where every employee's voice is important. A Nordic leader stresses the necessity of cooperation. In addition, he or she downplays their authority and often functions more as a coach for their employees. It's also important that the leader is able to inspire their employees to be a visionary, yet realistic at the same time. Another distinct part of Norwegian leadership and culture is its status of women in Norwegian society. Unrivaled by any other country across the globe, women in Norway are held in very high esteem. They hold positions of power and influence as leaders in every sector of the economy and in politics.
According to authors Anderson and Lindquist, their research into leadership styles, a country's leadership style is very much affected by the cultural norms and values within a country and reflected in the organization where people lead. Because Norway, Denmark, and Sweden share very similar geographical and cultural associations, it goes to reason that they also have very similar, but not necessarily the exact same type of leadership styles. So leadership style in Norway can be described as a flat leadership, and the researchers identified some characteristics of this leadership style, and they note that flat leadership style results in a wide disbursement of decision making and responsibility within a team. So this means that the leader is not necessarily responsible for decision making, and instead that responsibility is distributed out amongst the employees. However, a leader is expected to take responsibility of any problems that might arise because they are still considered a leader and should be doing leadership responsibilities outside of decision making. And the authors also note that this type of leadership style, flat leadership, in Norway might seem like it would be easier than leadership in other countries where a leader relies on authority for decision making. It might seem easier in that the leader doesn't have to make decisions and instead just kind of pushes that off onto the people on the team. However, what really happens in this type of leadership structure is that the leader has to be very good, very adept at motivating the whole team to pursue some organizational goal. So if the team doesn't share the leader's vision or the leader isn't very good at articulating the goals and how to achieve them, or if the people just don't agree with the leader, they just won't follow him or her. And it's also true of Norwegian culture that you're expected to have a lot of teamwork and that kind of thing. So people expect to be consulted, work on a team to come to a decision rather than somebody just taking responsibility for making a decision. And so what happens in these situations is that rather than someone making a decision in a pretty short amount of time, there has to be consensus, and so that takes a longer amount of time. But something else that is a bonus for Norwegians is that because they are also very individualistic people, they tend to adapt to change really well, and they work more creatively than you might see in other countries where people expect their leader to tell them what to do.
When we compare Norway to the United States using the Hofstede model of culture, we can see that Norway and the US have many similarities, but also some distinct differences associated with these 6 cultural frameworks in the model. For example, both the US and Norway scored within 9 points of each other for power distance. A low power distance for both countries means that people in Norway and the US don't subscribe to the concepts of a hierarchy. The two countries are quite different in terms of masculinity and femininity, as previously discussed. Norway is very low on masculinity at just 8 compared to the US with a 62. According to Chen in her 2014 paper on Nordic leadership, Norway is in the top 8 countries in terms of equal opportunity for men and women. She also noted that in countries with low masculinity or high femininity, people tend to seek consensus and work in cooperation with one another. This is consistent with Lewis's analysis, as he noted that Norway has many women in leadership roles in both the business and political sectors.
So, to answer the question, would I want to be a leader in Norway? Well, although I would like to be a leader in Norway, I think it would actually be very difficult. It seems like motivating employees to follow a vision could be more difficult than it might sound, especially with a high degree of individualism that Norwegians value. I would have to lean pretty heavily on creating a shared vision and developing a lot of trust on a team. Having grown up in the United States, I likely, and I hate to admit this, I probably have a lot more tendencies to be more authoritarian than I realize. And if I was just placed into a leadership role in Norway, I might struggle a bit. But I do like the concepts that are manifested in a flat leadership style of leading, because it seems like everyone is pulling in the same direction once everyone has a shared vision.
I'd like to be a leader in Norway. I think my ability to perceive individual skills and motives in order to apply them towards a common team goal would fit in line with the type of leadership that I'm already practicing now. I appreciate the Nordic values of modesty, practicality, and self reliance, and how those contribute to this overall success of a team. By nature, I'm not an autocratic leader, and I rely very much on collaboration to meet my organization's goals.